what is covert action, when to use it. A lot of people think of covert action as espionage. Espionage, we refer to as sort of the spying, collecting of information. Covert action is you use your intelligence arm to make things happen.
Welcome to Network 2020's audio edition of this virtual event. Be sure to check out our other events, media, and videos at network2020.org.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I'm the president of Network 2020. We're a New York-based nonprofit organization that is really striving to create more informed conversations around global affairs and international relations. Today, we're really pleased to have Jack Devine with us, and I'm in conversation with Frank Bean. So I will just run through their bios really quickly so you have a sense of who's speaking today, and then we'll get right to it. So Jack Devine, he's a founding partner and president of the Arkin Group, which specializes in international crisis management, strategic intelligence, investigative research, and business problem solving. He is a 32-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency, and he served as both acting director and associate director of CIA's operations outside the United States from 1993 to 1995, where he had supervisory authority over thousands of CIA employees involved in sensitive missions throughout the world. In addition, he served as chief of the Latin America division from 1992 to 1993 and was the principal manager of the CIA's sensitive projects in Latin America. Between 1990 and 1992, Mr. Devine headed the CIA's Counter-Narcotics Center, which was responsible for coordinating and building close cooperation between all major U.S. and foreign law enforcement agencies in tracking worldwide narcotics and crime organizations. From 85 to 87, he headed the CIA's Afghan task force, which successfully countered Soviet aggression in the region. And in 1987, he was awarded the CIA's Meritorious Officer Award for this accomplishment. His international experience with the U.S. government includes postings to Latin America and Europe. And during his more than 30 years with the CIA, he was involved in organizing, planning, and executing countless sensitive projects in virtually all areas of intelligence, including analysis, operations, technology, and management. He is the recipient of the agency's Distinguished Intelligence Medal and several meritorious awards. He is a recognized expert in intelligence matters and has written op-ed articles for the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, the World Policy Journal, and Politico. He has also made guest appearances on National Press Club, CNN, CBS, NBC, MSNBC, Fox News, C-SPAN, as well as the History and Discovery channels, PBS, NPR, and ABC. And his book actually came out in 2014, and it's called Good Hunting: A Spymaster's Story. And he will be led in conversation with Frank Bean, who serves as vice president for A.R. Walker & Company, which is a real estate management and investment company. And prior to this, he was vice president for Zakharyan Development, a residential and commercial development firm in South Russia. He holds a Master of Arts from the University of St. Andrews and has studied Russian in Russia, as well as national security and the modern Middle East at New York University. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Frank and Jack, and thank you both for being here today.
Thank you very much, Courtney. Good morning. Again, my name is Frank Bean, and on behalf of Network 2020, I would like to welcome you all to this virtual discussion. Before we start our conversation, I would like to remind the audience that you can submit a question at any time during the virtual discussion, but please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen as opposed to the chat function. So with that, Jack, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And let's start with just perhaps we'll start with a very broad question, which is, as a former legendary senior intelligence official, what keeps you up at night?
Legendary covers a lot of sins, you know.
I know.
It's a variable. For many years, people have asked the same question in one form or another, and I've always thought of what would be the most tragic event would be a nuclear exchange somewhere in the world. So, for decades, I've had India and Pakistan as areas that of concern, both equally armed with nuclear weapons and have had longstanding border disputes. They flare up. They flared up again this year. Having said that, that's the potential for a nuclear exchange. And I think why it keeps me awake, I think I would rate it as fairly remote. What I seem to be spending more time with today is what I would call a resurgent, and I addressed this even as early as 2014 in the book Good Hunting, and that is a resurgence of nationalism, populism coming together, and the diminution of democracy as a winning brand. I still believe strongly, and I believe our country is strong because of it. But today there's a great penchant for strong men and national interest. That increases the odds of confrontation between countries. And so I spend more time worrying about that and the direction of the overall challenge that presents. And whether you look at on the Russians or the Chinese, you look at Turkey, you look at the Philippines. I mean, if you pick countries that have democratic systems as well as autocratic ones, the strong person, the strong leader, infringement on possible civil liberties, and every one of those, not possible, in some cases clear cut. I think there's cause for concern because I believe that leads to greater prospects of confrontation. And I think we're at a point now where a confrontation is more likely than not in the next few years.
Well, speaking of strongmen, on July 1st, a referendum to reform the Constitution of Russia was passed that, among other things, effectively makes Vladimir Putin president for life. What do you make of this former KGB officer, and how does this man think about America, think about the Western world?
I think his KGB formation is really important in trying to understand Putin and his behavior. I don't think people focus on the fact that when he was in the KGB, and he wanted to join at age 17, he was rejected, but eventually it was something he really pressed, and he eventually got in. But he served, unlike many of the officers I met, whether it was in Paris or Mexico City or India, they were much more cosmopolitan. They'd seen the world. It was hard to deny the democracy and the liberty that was there. They made a best effort. But he went to Dresden, in Eastern Germany, which was really an extension of the hardline Soviet system. And the most famous spy actually works his way into Le Carré's books about espionage and Karla, the famous spy. So he worked in Dresden, in East Germany, in the time that Marcus Wolf, infamous Karla, actually ran these very intensive operations. And he was terribly disenchanted when the Soviet Union fell apart. He was a KGB officer. The KGB almost fell apart. It held on to, many of its people defected. They ran away with files. I mean, his country and his understanding of the world collapsed. And I think he was hard fixed at that time to reconstitute the Soviet Union into a stronger Russia and a stronger government. And again, he was young, and his approach to it, again, is framed in that East German idea of how you exercise power. And from there, he went to St. Petersburg, became involved in the political side of things, and however you want to frame it, the aide-de-camp or bagman for the mayor at the time. He learned a lot about politics and then worked his way back in his 30s into the power structure in Moscow. And when the old warriors were stepping aside, they were looking for someone they thought they could trust, and they picked and reached down and picked Putin. I think that speaks to his great political agility to be able to get to the top of a very competitive environment. He's cunning, he's smart, tough-minded. I mean, these are all positives. I said, but he has a rather narrow view of the world constructed in the old KGB East German mentality. So I give him high marks today. I think Russia's punching way above its weight. I mean, its economy matches Italy or France, depending on how you want to add it up. But he's extending power around the world. He's consolidated his position at home. But I think where he's short is strategic vision. Strategic vision is an old one. I mean, really, Russia should be in the West. Russia should be part of the, an active exchange. There is no reason. It's no longer a communist state. So I think he's been very effective in carrying out his mission. But I think over the long run, it'll turn out to be a weak hand. And I think we see some fraying around the edges today. He's not vulnerable. I know there's some that think that he is right now, but there are cracks in the system, and they're rooted in the economy. And in order to hold on to authoritative power, you have to use authoritative means, and that eventually becomes the seeds of your own defeat. So, I mean, that's a capsule on a very complicated guy, and one that is, the only thing I would add, go to another question, but I think he's underweighted in the aggressiveness of Russia. In other words, I think people are underestimating just how aggressive his operations are. I mean, I am a Cold Warrior. We fought hand to hand, if you will, with the Russians. But when I look at what he's doing, particularly in the cyber field, in terms of internal things, the United States is more aggressive than the old KGB. His adventures in Ukraine, Crimea, Syria, Venezuela, weakening the borders, it's very aggressive. And I think we are, and I'm not talking just leadership here, I think those that study this issue, I mean, I think we're missing the extent of this aggressiveness and how much of a national security threat it is.
Keeping with Russian aggression, Jack, how do you see the conflict in the Donbass, Lugansk, Donetsk region of Ukraine and Crimea? Is it in our national interest to provide support for Kiev, or is this something that we shouldn't get involved with?
There are moments in history where you need to move quickly. If not, you then, you're in the situation of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. So I think if one were looking at Russia, and you were looking at it in the pre-invasion of Ukraine, and you were looking at it, you say, well, what has historically made Russia strong? And it's Ukraine. Ukraine, as part of Russia, is a much more powerful country than Russia without it. So, and if we were assessing Putin as not being friendly toward the West or prepared to join in, that he was likely to be an adversary, then we should deny the Ukraine to the degree that we can and foster democracy in that region. And I think we did. But when he decided he was going to take the Crimea and take eastern Ukraine, I think we were slow to respond. And I think he pushed it as far as he can. And now I think he's probably using other tools of diplomacy and espionage to undermine the West. So, I do think we've upped our game and our support in Ukraine, but it's hard to imagine, and I hate to be pessimistic here for any Ukrainians that are listening, but it's hard to see how he rolls back out of the Crimea or eastern Ukraine in whatever form or shape. I think his goal is to co-opt the entire Ukraine, and that's a pretty aggressive step. There are many Ukrainians in the United States. We've had long ties with Ukraine, so I think we came up short on that one. Now, this is a problem, not to open Pandora's box, but when you start fighting wars, whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq, or lo and behold, both of them at the same time, that's not cost-free. It's not cost-free in either lives or treasure, but it's also, you shortchange all the other issues that you just can only concentrate. Washington has a really hard time at the top level concentrating on multiple issues. So I think we've spent a lot of time on understanding once wars start, they consume a lot of intelligence horsepower. So we begin to pay less attention to areas where adversaries or competitors, if you like, can make up and fill vacuums. And I think the war has cost us on those two fronts. We can argue about going in or not, but I think it's pretty safe to argue it's been a pretty costly affair, not just in the obvious, but also, how much attention and how much were we prepared to step into Ukraine.
So let's move to another very important, maybe the most important country at the moment for us, which is China. China's ambassador to the U.S., Shui Tiankai, was interviewed on CNN in July and defended Beijing's claim to the South China Sea, Hong Kong's new national security law, and remarkably, categorically denied that Uyghurs and other ethnic minority groups are or ever have been detained in mass internment camps. Since that interview, the Chinese consulate in Houston was shut down. China forced the closure of the U.S. consulate in Chengdu. And last week, the Trump administration sought to penalize two of China's most successful apps, TikTok and WeChat, and announced it would impose sanctions on Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, as well as 10 other senior officials. China responded by stating it would sanction U.S. lawmakers, including Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. Jack, do you anticipate that relations between the United States and China will continue to deteriorate? And what role should values, in our case, American values, play in foreign policy vis-a-vis China?
So a good way to answer that is to address Russia again. And what I'm jesting here on Russia, I think there was an opportunity to reset. We tried, and Putin turned us down, right? And that's why we've ended up where we are. China, and because that we have an aggressive program by the Russians, right? It's pretty clear to me, at least on that score. China, I think, is much more complex. I mean, they have real economic power, and I think they are a force to contend with. Russia is never going to be a preeminent power, but people do worry about China, and it's part of China's, unhidden. It's out there in the public domain. It anticipates having a primacy in Asia, but if you look more carefully in their efforts around the world, they really see themselves in a more patient, long-term way over the next 50 years, and making gains steadily through there to be the number one power in the world. So that's a challenge, which I wouldn't have a problem with if, in fact, they were a democratic state and there was, open competition and so on. But you have a communist party; it's autocratic. The civil liberties are indeed encroached upon. The ambassador seemingly failed to mention Hong Kong. I mean, if you want to look about it, anyone that has looked at the Uyghurs know that there's a problem there. So when a country decides it's going to exercise power and might and basically becomes imperialistic, they're going to expand their power, you now have a challenge in front of you. And it takes its form in, economic tension, political, military tension. So, to me, that is the bigger, longer-term problem. The juxtaposition with Russia, the longer one is the China problem, and we're seeing it now. It's interesting. There's very few things in Washington are bipartisan anymore, but there does seem to be bipartisan support about China. And so I think, however the next election turns out, I think there's going to be, going to a shorter version of your question, I do think the tensions with China are not going to be ameliorated, but will probably be intensified. And as I said, when you get in these situations, it takes two to the tango again. And I don't see China changing its international goals unless it has an economic crisis that forces it back into a hole. Your second part of the question was about values, and I spent all of my career in the espionage intelligence business and dealing with people that joined our side. I mean, that were working for us as spies. And no matter what you see in the movies, there was always, there was money, there were other reasons why, but in so many cases, they wanted to be part of that American system. And I think a lot of Americans undervalue just how much thirst there is around the world for people to identify with opportunity where there's a meritocracy. And I know all the wrinkles around the edges, but if you compare it to just any place in the world. So it was a great product. Now, the Russians were having a hard time selling the Soviet Union as a place of opportunity and economic growth and civil liberty, right? So I think it's a really strong value system that brings allies together in the democratic world. So when you match it with China, I think China has not gone through the political liberalization that so many people had hoped for. And I think consequently, they are going to come up with the short end of the stick as an autocratic power. Autocratic powers have their run, but I think democratic values are really the most important product. And not to deviate from the concept of your question, we need to make sure that those democratic values are deep and rich in the United States, so that we retain the power that's generated. You want to call it soft power, it's really not. It's a very dynamic power. This country needs to have, continue to shine as a land of opportunity and freedom. So I know that sounds like a pep talk, but honestly, I've lived it my life, and it's been one of the shields and swords that I was able to use to, push forward some of our national interest.
So keeping with China, just for one quick second, as China expands, it's bumping up not against America, but a whole series of different countries. And India-China border tensions recently resulted in a deadly skirmish in eastern Ladakh. Beijing has since claimed the entire Galwan Valley, but disengaged. Jack, I understand it's far-fetched, but what do you think is the likelihood of a dispute like the one in June escalating into a real protracted military conflict?
One of the problems and items that we keep you awake at night on that issue is they both have nuclear weapons. Now, the Chinese have a far superior capability, but let's say the Indians got 5 nuclear weapons off. I mean, the world changes with one. So it's so I think they're both sophisticated countries. This is statesmanship, it's power. India needs to have allies. China, has tried to develop and is developing strong ties with Pakistan as a counterweight to India. Our relationship with India in my lifetime have improved immensely, right? I mean, in terms of in the past, they were far less identified with Western, at least the European and the American interest. So, yeah, I think there's room for continued skirmishes, but I do think it'll be calibrated, and the Chinese will probably. I think it'll be probably more of a struggle of economics, and but I don't think we're going to have that exchange that will keep me awake. But it will be an area of real tension. As I said earlier, I think so much of the world there's room for border skirmishes and that unanticipated mistake, the black swan that comes out of nowhere, and people misjudge, underestimate, and underestimate a problem.
So moving to another part of the world now, there has been a string of fires and explosions at military and civilian sites across Iran in recent weeks. Many analysts and diplomats suspect sabotage by Israel, the United States, or some other outside force. Jack, in your 2014 memoir, Good Hunting, an American Spymaster story, you write about the importance of covert action. In the case of Iran, is covert action an effective policy? And as a follow-up, do you think the targeted killing of General Soleimani in January was a smart or reckless presidential decision?
Right. So let me start with the macro issue of the hot spots that I would be worried. I'd have Iran really very much high on the totem pole. I mean, it's a country that's facing economic problems. That has the virus is hitting it harder just because of its nature of society. It's not as open to this. There's competition all through the Middle East between the Sunni and Shias and the Iranians, and so there's a lot of room here and tension for a confrontation. And the Iranians also have a network around the world, which if they're not able to take on a power through normal overt military means, they have ways of generating serious terrorism. We've seen it throughout the history where they've caused problems. So I see Iran as one of the top targets of top subjects of concern. And then you get to the question of, this is more of a, I don't want to say theoretical, but it's a philosophical question about covert action. Good hunting, one of the main purposes was to define what is covert action, when to use it. A lot of people think of covert action as espionage. Espionage, we refer to as, sort of the spying, collecting of information. Covert action is you use your intelligence arm to make things happen. In the United States, it's very well controlled by Congress and the President of the United States. There is no covert action. There's none that I know of in my long career that was undertaken without the signature of the President of the United States. So that's one of those items that very few people recognize. When you see the CIA acting, and it's not a rogue elephant, there's maybe one or two cases where there were sidebars, like Iran-Contra, where people were doing things off the books, but it wasn't the agency, it was people working in the agency. And I don't mean to split hairs, but when I look at covert action, there's certain ingredients, and it's really the argument. I've only stolen the argument from an argument of just war, where they use Aquinas or Augustine or any of the philosophers that talked about this when people talked about theology. It's, you have to have a strategic, you have to have a intrinsically evil enemy, right? So that you can get into arguments about what that means. You have to make sure that you have the capability for success. So if you're going down the road in Iran, you better have some sense, not that you just have an enemy, but that you're going to be successful. You minimize the bloodshed, you protect the innocent civilians. So these are some of the ingredients that you have to think about when you go into it. So when the agency is asked to do covert action, and it was uniquely its terrain during the early until recently, where the military has moved into a gray area that looks to me like covert action. I would ask people that are practitioners to stop and think about it. Just because you have a problem, you don't get into covert action and put people in jeopardy unless you think your success, that it's warranted, and real national interests are at stake. But I added a couple of my own to add to the theologians, and one was make sure you have bipartisan support, because if you don't, and when I ran the program during the heyday of the in Afghanistan against the Russians, we had substantial bipartisan support, and it was a very effective program. Same time, we were running the program in Central America, which was nothing but a what would I call it, a battleground between political elements, and it was a fraught problem because of the lack of bipartisan. So I really encourage it. The other thing is, many times Congress will give money to a covert action, the president will support it because they feel that the American people want us to do something, but it's half-hearted, so they don't fund it properly. So if you're going to do it, no, I'm going to use a vulgar expression instead. I'll say, make sure you have your planning all worked out. Don't do it in a half-baked, thank you, I found a better word than one of what's going to be, half-baked scheme on how to do something. You have to have the plumbing laid in. You can't, someone decides, look, I'm going to have covert action, I'm going to sign this. I almost called the book, All It Takes Is a Spark, instead of Good Honey, because I had so many people come in and said, Jack, look, my country needs help. You just light this spark, it's going to fall apart because it's in such bad state. And I said, look, there's the door. It's been nice knowing you. Come back when you tell me that the people on the ground want it. They've got the support. We're going to carry it out. The other thing I'm a big believer in the same covert action is you don't put troops on the ground if you don't have to. And one of the reasons I'm not happy about the Afghanistan program is the one we ran was really using, surrogates. And I thought we did a great job, we, the United States government, and CIA and special forces in particular, in getting rid of the Taliban. But that was done not with boots on the ground. That was not significant. So boots on the ground are it's a big step, and it's hard to get out, as Colin Powell and others have often written to. So the use of covert action is to prevent us from getting troops on the ground, but the stakes have to be high, it have to be real. So when we get to Iran, I don't know whether those activities are covert action or not. Maybe it's merely designed to slow down the nuclear program. That may be justified by those who are looking at it. I probably wouldn't have a problem with it myself personally. But if you're talking about regime change, there you have a risk of tremendous amount of violence and bloodshed and uncertain outcome. And there, I think, there has to be very thoughtful reflection, bipartisan support, and a real shoulder to the wall effort to make it happen. My sense is we're not there. I don't feel that the conditions for it are there, and so I would not recommend a robust regime change covert action. And I might, again, remember I'm a private citizen. This is me talking to the 2020, but as an abstraction, I probably would find steps to try and stop that nuclear program from developing to be a highly desirable thing. Once you have your first nuclear weapon, you're in a different position in the power world. That's why people get them. But you're also much more dangerous. And that would kick off a terrible situation for us in the Middle East, around the world.
You know, you spoke, you were just speaking about Afghanistan, and the CIA with special forces in the fall of 2001 were very successful routing the Taliban, basically using the Northern Alliance to do a lot of the fighting. After more than 18 years of conflict in Afghanistan, and now we have a real military presence, do you see the Taliban as the same organization it was in 2001? And what do you imagine will happen once we withdraw from that country?
Well, one of the things, not going back to defend the military program, people have to understand the Taliban did not exist when the U.S. government was driving the Russians out. You know, we were with the Mujahideen. The Taliban is and Obama, not Obama, Bin Laden was really he was there and was supported by Arab nations. He received no U.S. money, but he was a nobody. I mean, a true nobody. So in those days, left and went to Sudan. So that first Afghan war was not about the Taliban. The second, when 9/11 was taken and Bin Laden was in Afghanistan, was to go in and get him. That was the objective, and that seemed to me to be a great objective, that they could bring the Taliban down using the Northern Alliance, which were, you know, it wasn't their sons, it was the same guys I dealt with 20 years earlier in many cases, right? So I think that was really the right program. Today, I think it's you know, we got, once you get in, this is the problem. You get in there, the Russians learned it, the Brits learned it, and going in is a you know, it's just a very costly proposition. And I don't want to get into the numbers on this, and what it cost us to do in the Afghan war against the Russians and what it costs today. I mean, I think the momentum is for us to get out. Bin Laden's dead. You know, I think you make the best effort you can to protect our interest, including covertly. But I think our presence in Afghanistan will shrink. And I am not expecting to see a sea of democracy. I didn't expect to see it when we were there. It's still a tribal society. And I think as we pull out of Iraq, that too is going to be an unfortunate outcome, in the sense that I'm not suggesting we stay by any stretch of the imagination, but I think we look at Iraq, it's going to be a problem country for a long time. And I would hope we would exert our influence and support friends there, but I don't see how a large military presence for any length of time makes a lot of sense to me.
So in that neighborhood, supporting people might mean supporting absolute monarchs or authoritarian leaders or dictators. What do you see the future of, you just talked about Iraq, but Syria, Egypt, Libya? If we're not going to really affect regime change, the problems that happen in those countries seem to touch us nevertheless.
Well, I'm just talking about the dynamics of working abroad and picking your friends. I mean, it is not the U.S. mission to create democracy around the world. I mean, there have been some adventures to that, right? So I think we're our national interest. And then to the degree that we can, we should encourage and promote not only democracy, but our values, our human rights values. It was interesting, and Jimmy Carter, I would not rank him as one of my highest presidents. I thought the handling of Iran was poorly done. But one thing he did do, which was revolutionary, was he really pushed human rights around the world. And that meant everybody in your U.S. government, once the president decides, moves in that direction. And I will tell you, as an intelligence officer with dictatorships, or no matter what it was, we were in there saying, you know, you need to behave. And it did change, and it was interesting. And again, very little has been written and focused on how important, what a role that played. In Latin America, which I know reasonably well, was very dictatorial at the beginning of the 70s, and was largely a democratic continent by the time we get into the 80s. So, you know, values, we sometimes have to deal with dictators because, you know, of our economic, political interests, whether we have a bigger adversary, but we should never condone anything that is a violation of our values, and we should try to promote as much as we can within that system. And I think that's true of the State Department and U.S. government officials at large. So it's not that, I think I don't see professionals embracing dictators, right? It's just, you're kind of stuck with them sometimes, and you got to work with what you have, but you can't diminish your values in the process and go along and support their activities.
Okay, well, before we get to, we have a number of questions from the audience. Let me just ask you one more question, which is a nice way to kind of bookend the conversation. Jack, how has the intelligence community changed or evolved since you retired? And what do you think are the major challenges facing the agency in 2020, 2021?
A very famous KGB officer who later became president once said, once a KGB officer, always one, right? So I've never thought of myself retired. I've kept this mindset of CIA. I use we, even though, you know, I can't go in the door without a special permit, even though I had a really meaningful job there. So I still think, like he thinks in KGB terms, I will probably address things all in the CIA. So when I look at it, what's the evolution of it? I mean, collecting information will always be part of it, and trying to help the executive make things happen will always be part of it. And I think that part is indeed very much the mission. What I find is extraordinary is just the technological. I mean, you would think I was born in the Stone Age if I started to tell you how we communicated. I mean, there weren't computers. I put the first set of computers in Latin America because no one else wanted it, right? It should have been going to the other higher priorities, but we tried it. Yeah. Secure communication, I mean, it's the revolution. In fact, in 2015, they created a new directorate. It's the first directorate since 1962. When the satellite went up, they created the science and technology one. In 2015, they created the digital directorate of operations and admin and intelligence. So I think the biggest revolution is offense and defense, cyber, communications, being able to identify people, target people. I don't know if it's true or not. I was listening to the radio this morning in Chicago, the riots they were handled by, basically was inspired by a cyber type of activity, you know. So we used to work and have to pay people to put placards up, right? Today, you sit in your bedroom and send tweets, and you can, you know, put the world on fire. So I think the revolution is there, but the war has gone that way. The intelligence war was, you know, collecting, and then, you know, we would organize groups and pay them. But today, and this is what I want to come back to, the aggressive behavior of Russia and China vis-a-vis the United States. They are using cyber in bare knuckle fashion with the United States, and you know, I don't have visibility into it, but I don't see any indication that we are anywhere as aggressive in using cyber as part of your military strategic offense. And I think that's the reality of today, is the impact of technology on every aspect. The amount of data, I mean, honestly, it's just revolutionary. When I sat in Chile many years ago, we didn't have any English language papers. You didn't have that, you know, your information was very valuable because no one had it. Today, you know, I can sit here, as every one of us can. We're communicating across broad spectrum. We can look by satellite at a dot. It's a private citizen, we can do this. And so we're inundated with information. How do you get a handle? How do you separate the good from the bad in there, you know? How do you use it to cause trouble? How do you cause it to protect yourself from people causing trouble? I mean, these are huge issues, and I hope our best minds are on them.
So we have a kind of a tricky question from the audience, which I'm sure you won't have a problem answering. How has the CIA, in your opinion, changed under the Trump administration? And could you talk about the deep state with the administration, or Trump himself references quite often?
Now tell me again why that was an easy question.
Nothing's hard for you, Jack.
No, but I think this is a good point to that states something that I think needs to be understood in the intelligence world. And I will tell you, growing up in it, it was nonpartisan. I can't tell you the people around me whether they voted Republican or Democrat. I just couldn't tell you because it was unprofessional. You didn't talk, you talk about the world, but you wouldn't be talking a lot about presidential, congressional. It's really because when you go into the CIA, there's a quote from the New Testament on the wall. You shall know the truth, and it'll set you free. That's your product. You're not making a new Ferrari. Your product is intelligence. That means unbiased information. And you're trained, and it's everything about you. You would be shown the door if you started politicizing inside the agency. And the reason it's dangerous, because if you have it in there, it's just one more, it's a propaganda element. So I think in understanding the makeup of the intelligence world, it's the nonpartisan part of it. And when even with my clients, I maintain that nonpartisan. I try to look at things. None of us can be totally successful because we're human beings, but nonpartisan to look at problems is actually one of the things that I present to clients in discussing things. So when you get around to administrations, administrations come and go, right? But cultures stay much longer now. You might say we need to change the cultures. The cultures change, and they do change. Let me just do, at the risk of stepping into a landmine, women's rights in the intelligence world. When I joined, I think we had one senior woman. In my training class, there were 50 of us, and there were 2 women, right? Today, 50% of the jobs are held by women. It's a senior job, 50% of people being trained. The director, the chief of worldwide operations are women. In other words, you can change. Culturally, you change. But the idea of partisanship changing because a president wants to change is a tougher nut to crack. There's built-in resistance inside the intelligence community to interference in it, and it's been largely respected. It's really hard to understand just how much people get their backup. I used to get into fights when I was running the counter-narcotics program because I just thought it was a lousy sentence. Somebody said you're politicizing because you're putting a semicolon in. Well, I don't like semicolons, so probably I was taking one out. So there was such sensitivity about it, and the agency has very few political appointees. In fact, the head of the agency, and thank God, is it's something we all hope for, and that is that you have career professionals, because we think it's a sort of esoteric business. So I think the ability, the muscle in agency, and the agency, again, it's just not the CIA, it's all the intelligence agencies. You do it at your own peril, right? So I found it interesting that the very first place that Trump went to after his election, literally the first government installation was CIA. And it was interesting. And I think his selection of Gina Haspel has been extremely well received inside of the agency, and has been a real force in policy. So I think presidents, at the beginning sometimes have ideas about the intelligence community, but after a while the realities set in. The one thing that all the people in the CIA want more than anything else is to be used. In other words, they're not in it to make money. They're not in it just to travel. They're in it to make a difference. So the morale in the agency is quite high today, and I would expect it to be. Why? Because the world really needs the intelligence world. And so I think the morale is pretty high. I want to address Soleimani because that's a really good point. And it goes to your earlier question of covert action. It goes to the question of Iran. It goes to the question of the Trump administration. And again, I'm going to tell you the way I see it, and then you're going to think it's partisan, have at it. But, it's to pull that trigger is a really, really tough thing. But here you had a case of a real hitman. Soleimani, there's so much blood on his hand as it relates to the United States. And I'll come back to my Afghan experience. I was there and part of the process to put the stinger in. And the most senior level of U.S. government, by and large, did not want to put the Stinger missile. And for those that don't know about it, it was the missile used to shoot down the helicopters that were really crushing our support effort. And when the missile was fired, Russian policy changed. But the fear was that Russia was going to respond with full force. And you can go to a meeting, any cabinet meeting, and someone will come up and say, oh my God, if we start this, something's going to happen. And that's a hard argument to go against. No president was, God, it's going to be bad and everything's going to, people are going to die. It's a really tough call. In this case, in Soleimani, they had him and they could take him out. And again, there was a case in bin Laden, a famous case where there was a chance, and I wasn't there, so I don't know, but it's been written to the fact that they missed the shot. They took a shot about Soleimani, but the key question wasn't whether he was a real enemy of our country. That's not the debate. But what were the consequences? And the world was going to turn and go on and burn up in smoke, and that didn't happen. The responses, don't underestimate the Iranians' sophistication and the diplomacy and negotiating. They're great negotiators. So when Soleimani was hit, they were all upset. They could have burnt the world down in demonstrations, but they knew there was a price to pay. So what did they do? They fired off a dozen missiles. They called ahead of time and said, nope, we're not firing any more than this, And so they calibrated that they could have a response, but it was not the world's on fire response. And I would go back and I would give, not every speech that the president made would I be in agreement with, but his very first sentence was a stroke of genius in my point of view, and it said, there is a red line. The Iranians will not have the nuclear weapon. Now, we moved on right away. Everyone moved on. I will tell you that is a critical point. If the Iranians accept that as a reality, it's the only thing that stands in the way of them having a nuclear weapon. So if history were to replay Soleimani, I'm not saying it's cost-free, but was it the right move? It wasn't just the right move in the case of how the Iranians respond, but I would tell you, in Kim Jong-un's mind, he's sitting there, the message is, don't keep pressing your luck with the nuclear weapon. So it is the use of force. It was run, obviously there was high levels of intelligence about where he was. It was, it was not anything done lightly, but it was a decision had to be made quick. But in the context of a just war, or what the requirements of taking force and action, it met the bar. And I think it was the right move, and I think it's actually been helpful. But the world moved so quick that we can't dwell on it because there's so many other pieces. That was a great moment. Now, what else needs to be done to do that? So I think it's a great lesson in decision making, the types of pressures that are around it, the outcomes. And I think you picked a good example. I know at the time there was a lot of dispute. It seemed to me that it was more political and not so much about, was that a good thing to do? And in days going by down on the Hill, I think you would have more support for that type of action, bipartisan, you would today. That was really one for the country, I think.
We have a question from the audience that's almost the flip side of that coin, which is what was the CIA's role in Lebanon? And maybe you could speak about, this wasn't in the question, but Bill Buckley, the embassy bombings. Something similar in what we did to Soleimani was done to us in the 80s, and it had pretty disastrous, effects for our intelligence capability in that region.
Well, the reason people use terrorism because it's a very effective tool, and it allows you to fight above your weight. And Buckley was a hugely tragic case. He was a fine officer. And again, the audience may not be familiar with, but he was captured and tortured. And the videos were sent back to the agency, and Director Casey and the president watched them. Were just seized with both anger and do everything they could to get Buckley back. It is actually the genesis of the Iran-Contra affair. I think I was involved. I was chief of Iranian operations. I'm on record as saying I thought that trading missiles to the Iranians, so it was opposed to the idea throughout, and we can go over that someday. But the um, the Iranian decision that was wrong-footed was rooted in this personal feeling of disgust about what had happened to Buckley, and it clouded the vision of some of the bigger strategic issues. The bombing of the Marine barracks, I mean, over 200 of our young people were killed in that, including another sterling guy, Ames, from from the analytical side, who was a very highly respected guy, was killed in the bombing. But our reaction there was to pull out our presidents. That was President Reagan, a strong president, but we've just pulled out. So that terrorism, it took a long time. They were trying to decide what the response was. Well, I can't remember the exact days, but I think it was 2 or 3 months before we fired off a couple of cruise missiles. Our response was pretty weak to that. And so terrorism, and it comes in waves. And it's very hard to predict why, but we had tremendous terrorism in the 70s. People have forgotten it, or, you know, not only in Latin America, but through Europe. And so it comes, the minute I say it, there'll be some terrible explosion somewhere, but, you know, terrorism is falling down the level of priorities, and nation state issues are now in this ascendancy. Everything I know about the current explosion, I mean, I don't know anything more than anybody in this room. You know, seems to me it's great. It's really incompetence, and I don't see the Iranians behind it. I'm ready to be proven wrong on it. At first, I thought it was. I mean, every time you see an explosion, you know, it has to be one of the terrorist groups. But I mean, this thing, I think, was so huge, and I see nothing that points in that direction yet. I've seen no reporting. There's a lot of reporting about incompetence. So I'm not prepared to put that in the same bag as the other incidents you're referring to.
In the 70s, Jack, I know there were rumors that you spent a lot of time in Caracas. Maybe you can confirm or deny them, but we have a question from the audience that wants to know what the agency's role should be in Venezuela now, as the country seems to be almost a failed state at this point.
Now, that's a really good question, because it puts my theory to test, right? And in other words, it's a country that's fallen apart. Our national interests are high, but as I said, in theological terms, you're intrinsically evil. You know? So I ask you a question: but they're no intrinsically evil, right? I mean, how much is he screwing up our national interest? The ingredients are there on the ground, or they were there. I mean, Chavez was actually overthrown. I mean, he was overthrown, put on a ship, but the opposition couldn't figure out what to do, so the military brought him back. I mean, they actually took a page out of the Chile coup book, if you will, of how the Chileans planned their coup and CIA's role in it. But, you know, you have to have an opposition that's capable of governing. It's one of the problems in Venezuela today. Again, I've been away for a long time, but you don't have a meaningful opposition. The other thing is the leftist government's been in power for a long time. Allende in Chile was there for 3 years. So, you know, the Cubans are in advising. You know, a coup there, I don't see the ingredients on the ground. What I think you are very likely to have is that you're going to have what is a really, truly, there was a description about Chile back in those days, and the one that I subscribed, it was going to fall of its own weight. And the military actually got out in front, or it would have fallen, but, you know, of its own weight. This government's going to fall of its own weight. It's so bad, eventually it just self-implodes. You know, some group somewhere, people in the streets march. It's overwhelming. The police refuse to fire on their own people, thank God, or whatever. And the government it won't be a brilliant CIA covert action operation. That's my prediction. You can put it down in the books. But I do think the government is not meant to last. People thought it was going to go a year ago. They thought it was going to go 5 years. It's like, you know, when was Assad going to go. All the betting was 6 months. Here we are years later, right? People underestimate the durability of even decrepit, corrupt governments. So never sell that short. But I'm getting the sense that Madeira, it's really fallen apart, and it's a matter of time. Is it this year, next? But I would say, to your point, CIA, you don't need to foment a coup. And if I were down on the Hill, I would say, support the opposition. Give them whatever help you can to strengthen stop the encroaching on every democratic right that you have. So I think it's more of a defense game, and eventually you're going to wake up to a tremendous crisis in which the president's going to figure out what the hell to do in a couple of minutes, and everyone else is. So, but I think trying to speed up the process is probably not productive at this time.
I think we have time for one more question. And could you speak on what we can do as a country to prepare us to prevent outsiders from negatively affecting the election in November? Is there anything that we can do that we're not doing?
Well, first of all, Frank, you've come to the game very late.
It's too late, right? It's already been happening, I guess. Yeah.
Now, so what can you do? You're president of the United States. You pick up the phone and you say, "Look, you really can't screw around here. You call the Chinese." I mean, we're sending messages every way we can, and they're clearly in our system, and there's no doubt about it. There was an intelligence estimate recently that both the Russians and Chinese are in. I really have questions about the wisdom of their strategy, but I think the Russian one is clearer, which is general destabilization of the West, whereas they don't really care so much about Trump or Biden, in my view. It's just to make this their biggest enemy is what we really started this discussion, which is how strong is democracy? How much is that of a powerhouse? And so, what do you do if that's what you weaken it? You weaken it and use a hybrid warfare, if you will. So, I mean, that's their objective, and I find it extremely offensive, to say the least, with a Democrat with a small d here. So, I think at this point, the only thing you can do is, I've also talked of such a thing as Moscow rules in the case of the Russians, where we had an understanding. There's some writing about Moscow rules being what hat you wear when you go on espionage, or don't take the subway or whatever. But what I was really referring to when I talk about it is an understanding we had between the KGB and ourselves. There were certain things we weren't going to do. We weren't going to counterfeit money. We weren't going to beat up each other's officers. We'd be constantly fighting in bars or whatever. So there's no written, something like the Magna Carta, right? But so my point is there has to be a better understanding in the world today. And again, it takes two. If you go to the table and they don't show up, you're stuck, right? But I really think there needs to be these discussions about how are we going to conduct ourselves with diplomacy, and how are we going to conduct the rules of the behavior of the game. And it seems to me that those aren't really well defined, and consequently, until they are defined. But if the other party doesn't want to play your best wishes, then you are forced into it. And that's where I think we are now. I'm not sure of that. And that is, if they keep it up, what do we do? It's the Cold War response. We're going to do the same to you. And if we do, then we're really, we're cranking up confrontation. But how long we really bedrock foundation of our country is free and open elections. So if someone's meddling in it, well, we're going to have to take action. And I think you make that as clear as you can. You try to get the other person to accept credibility, and then you have to do it. I'm not suggesting it needs to be done yet, but if we can't find a common ground, then we have to bring the other party to the table. It's just historic statesmanship and war gamemanship. I mean, how do you lessen the problem? By trying to get people to talk. Sometimes it takes some muscle to do that.
Well, before Courtney, I guess, sends us out, I just want to thank you so much for joining us. We could probably listen for another 5 hours to you speak, but we're gonna let you go. And I want to plug your book, which is We're Holding Our Breath, is supposed to drop in January, you said. So I'm sure everyone will go out and buy that. And again, thank you very much for joining us, Jack. It was very informative.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you so much, Jack. And if you book does come out in January, please, I hope you'll join us. I think everyone says that they have about a 1 hour limit to Zoom conversations, but I agree with Frank. I think we could have kept on going.
Thank you for listening to Network 2020's audio edition of this virtual briefing. Click on the link in the description below to view all of our upcoming events and find out how you can become a member and gain access to our members-only benefits.